Okay, I'm going to talk about how to change an alternator. Recently in my car, my Bronco, I have had an issue with my alternator. And I first thought it was battery, and then I realized it was actually the alternator after running a draw test. Basically, to start out, to run a draw test, to basically find out if it's the alternator or anything else in the car, you need to have a multimeter and a fresh battery or a new battery, basically a battery that's fully charged. The only way to do this without one of those is basically you just have to find something to have power to be able to see what's wrong. First, I had to take my multimeter, hook it up to the ground cable with the positive wire off my multimeter, hook the ground for the multimeter up to the ground side of the battery. And then as I did that, I went through every fuse on both my fuse boxes, under the hood and in the car, pulled them out one by one to see where the amp draw was coming from, to see why my battery was dying overnight. And as I went through, I found out that it wasn't a fuse, which pretty much upset me, and I couldn't tell what the problem was. So I had to get physical and get underneath the hood. I first went to my starter solenoid, and I found out that wasn't the cause. Pulled it off, wasn't taking no power. Pulled off my starter, wasn't taking no power. So I started to fool around with some engine things, the ignition switch and all that stuff. None of it was taking power. Finally, I was able to get to the alternator, which was underneath about 3 or 4 hoses, and if I started my car, I couldn't touch it because the hoses were extremely hot. So I pulled my alternator diodes off. Boom, I found the draw. And thanks to that, I was able to figure out that I needed to change my alternator. My alternator was going bad. I ran more tests to make sure with my alternator by hooking my battery up, starting my car, pulling the pulling the positive wire cable off. By doing that, if the car stalls, it's not the alternator. But if the car keeps running and keeps going, it's still not the alternator. So what did it do? It died. My alternator was bad. So I realized that was my problem, and I had to go out and buy a new alternator. First thing was I had to go buy a new one, $100 and something. Later, as I was doing that, when I got the alternator in and I took the old one out of my car, I had to take out about 5 or 6 screws. I had to bolt it into the car, and then I had to save them because otherwise I didn't know if the ones that came with the new one would fit into my car. As I took it out, I realized that the wires in the alternator were bad because they were hanging at the bottom and they were fried and frayed. So there was my main cause of my amp draw. And changing the alternator was actually pretty difficult for me due to the fact that my belts were completely different from what the alternator I bought was. So I was in a predicament. I had to change out the belts too, and I had to actually buy a new fan in order to run the new alternator. Because without that new fan, I wouldn't be able to do the alternator because the belts are so different. As soon as I got the old alternator out, I started to move everything around so I could get the new one in. When I put the new one in, and I screwed everything back into place, hooked the belts up, hooked everything up, and I put the diodes back in together, put the fuses back in, and made sure everything was hooked up, turned it on, and no power. Couldn't figure out what was wrong. So, I ran another draw test to make sure that my battery was still alive, and my battery was working. 12.5 volts. What you need. So, I realized I had hooked my alternator up wrong. And by doing that, I could have shortened it out by just trying to start my car. Luckily, I didn't. I was able to take the alternator, change what I did to it, put it back in there, put it in right this time, and now my car starts up. Unfortunately, I don't have the video of me doing this because my camera was not working at the time, and then the time that I was able to actually put it back in there, my camera worked, and now for some reason it doesn't want to upload. So, I will provide a PowerPoint on how to change out an alternator and how to go through the process of finding the amp draw because of how my alternator killed my battery. Basically, what I'm trying to say is if your battery starts dying, take it to a mechanic or take it to somebody who knows cars and have them run a draw test on it. If they run a draw test and find there's something wrong, that way they can figure out what's going on. And that way they can tell you if it needs a fuse, you need an alternator, you need a starter, because you don't want to come out in the middle of the morning trying to go to work, trying to go to class, and your car doesn't start. Then you're pretty much SOL. You're out of luck. And I actually ran into this one morning. Car didn't start. I was trying to go to class, and I got left here. So, basically, the moral of the story is make sure your car works. If it doesn't, have somebody figure out what's wrong with it, because having to replace an alternator is not fun. It's very dirty work. It's one of those things that you need to have a professional do it, unless you know how to do it. And I hope that some of the information I've provided in this video was helpful, but I hope the PowerPoint is a little bit more helpful because it will show you how to do it. So thank you for watching. And my aides for this were my sister's fiance. He's an auto mechanic and he used to work at Advanced Auto Parts. My dad, who used to be a car salesman and used to work in the garage, and my uncle, who has worked on transmissions and cars his entire life. So again, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed.